Hello. I am here with Lyman and Lyman. The first, or should I say, fourth Lyman, uh, is Owl Ventures investor and head of strategic M&A. And Lyman, the fifth, is his newborn son, who may or may not be participating in this conversation. We'll see
We'll
how it
see.
goes. Lyman, thank you for being here.
Of
And
course.
I think we're gonna talk about some M&A stuff today. It's
Awesome.
the week before GSV, everybody is sort of, putting out their stockings for Santa Claus and getting ready for the big event. Maybe just an easy one to start. What's your favorite sort of GSV tradition? I imagine you do a couple of things now that you've been going to this for a few years.
Well, my honestly, my favorite event that I would go to, I'm probably not invited to anymore, which is the Clever dinner that they always host at Nobu. I was a customer for
Oh,
7 years, so I always enjoyed that, and they always assembled a pretty amazing crew. So I'm not sure I'm getting the invite to that one, but that was always one I really like to go to. And yeah, I always loved it. The Tech Insiders events, especially.
sure.
Most recently I've always just like drawn an awesome crowd. Um, and yeah, there's I think some really good happy hours from our banker friends as well. I always try to go to the Goldman and Moelis ones. So yeah, the dance card's pretty full this year. But and sorry, I'm looking down. I'm just trying to make sure he doesn't, start crying in the middle of the interview. Um,
That's awesome.
but yeah,
I
so
uh, I didn't realize I should have emailed Trish to get her on this week too. Try and get an invite to
yeah,
the dinner.
I know it is a great event. There's a great crew as you can imagine.
Awesome. Yeah, and I would double down on your recommendation for the Insiders event too. They draw a great crowd, and it's outdoors, so it's not loud. I feel like every GSV, my voice hurts and my ears hurt
Mhm.
by the end of it. So the outdoor events I particularly enjoy because I can actually hear the people I'm talking to.
Oh,
Um,
totally.
um, any fun things you've heard about that either companies are doing or people are doing to help keep the event interesting?
Um, so I think one I actually really like is one of our recent portfolio companies, Starbridge, uh, has kind of tapped into, I would say, probably one of the things that's in highest demand at ASU GSB, and that's spaces to meet. I think as we've all noticed, it's gotten a bit chaotic. And so they actually kind of, one of the coffee shops right outside behind the Hyatt, reserved kind of spaces that folks can book and do tables. So I think that's really great. And again, it's probably the biggest gripe from everyone I've talked to every year, just in terms of, it's like every meeting invite is lobby Starbucks, and then you're looking around for 5 minutes trying to find the next person that you're meeting
You have
with.
their
So
LinkedIn profile on your cell phone,
yeah,
a tiny
yeah,
picture, like, right, this might be them.
exactly. Also, like the names and the badges have never gotten bigger, which is another one of my personal gripes. But yeah, honestly, I think that was a really cool idea. Um, and and yeah, I'm definitely going to be utilizing that.
Awesome. Yeah, I think anything you can do to make the event more interesting year over year uh, is a good thought. One of the other things that I've been thinking about is, the headline of the event is obviously going to be AI, and the second headline is going to be AI, and the third headline is going to be AI. But what are the things that you think folks will be talking about behind closed doors, right? In the suites in the Seaport Tower? Like, what are the types of conversations that you imagine are happening, but are a little bit away from the public eye?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think number one, especially in relation to AI, is I think for any, newer startups trying to pitch larger strategics on partnerships or starting to get to know them, maybe because they see them as, long-term exit paths. And startups pitching investors as well. The one thing that folks really haven't figured out is, what is an actual moat? What is a competitive advantage for a lot of the AI forward companies we're seeing? Deep and meaningful usage is great. It's like seemingly pretty easy to get to, 3 to 5 million in revenue, in very lean fashion these days. But what I think strategics and, the M&A buyers and also investors are trying to parse out, outside of things they can readily evaluate like normal, like the team, is, what is special about a lot of these new products that have popped up, and what is the actual competitive advantage and what is the moat? And I think that is the biggest question all of us who are, putting money to work, are asking ourselves.
Yeah, and obviously you are extremely well qualified to talk about that from both the strategic side and the investor side, having been Nuzella's head of corp dev before your role at Owl. So I think it's sort of funny. Like when I think about GSV, I sort of treat it as a place to catch up with folks and then
Yep.
like meet people that I have never had contact with before. And I don't have a ton in between. I always feel like in the years where I was an active investor, it was like sort of hard to do a pitch meeting just because there's so much going
Yeah.
on and there's always people walking by interrupting you and that type of thing. But um, so like I used it as more of like a, top of funnel conversation, if you
Yeah.
will, of like, make sure that we have a touch point and then we'll catch up in
Yeah.
more substance like a week later
Let's
or two
meet, then
weeks
agree to
later.
meet.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the moat concept because I would imagine that a lot of the strategics today are having these conversations of like, you know, our balance sheets are doing okay. We
Yeah.
don't have quite the same access to credit to buy stuff that we might have a few years ago, but the market is at the very least like ESSER dollars are flowed out, so we're at a more stable base. And we could think about acquiring things, but we're kind of not sure what to acquire.
Yeah.
Is that like consistent with what you're seeing and hearing? Like,
Yeah.
what does that look like from a problem solving standpoint?
So I think there are, I would say that first of all, the appetite for incubation, buying tech and team, especially with maybe AI forward skills, I think is actually increased. There was kind of a lull in that in 2022 and 2023 as folks are trying to figure out how to even like determine, who's a really good, AI developer or expert, and what types of products and use cases will actually create durable businesses. Now, um, I think the strategics have largely figured it out, or at least have a lens on where they want to buy and where they will consider kind of tech and team tuck-ins. Like I've talked to 4 or 5 different corp dev directors over the last, month, um, that have I think shored up and been able to like succinctly describe the type of use cases and like AI specific talent that they would go for. So I think despite
Just to
some of
double down
our
on
oh
that,
yeah
is the answer to that just like AI engineers, or is it more nuanced than that? Like,
I
what
think
beyond like
yeah
people who can code with AI?
I think those are still in very high demand as well.
Right.
Um, but I think uh, CEOs, developers, founders that have created products that I think match a use case that's either similar to one that these products already serve, or that has become a strategic priority that they need to maybe add in next to their product portfolio. Um, so that there kind of needs to be that like early product momentum, and there needs to be a product and maybe signs of product market fit, I would say.
So is it like sort of demonstrated ability to launch something with AI?
Yes.
And
Yes.
you talked about that mindset earlier of like demonstrated ability to launch with a small team in
Yes.
contrast to, what you might have something that might have been 40 people is now 6 or something like
Yeah.
that. Okay.
Exactly. And there's a I can't claim this is my own, but there's a really great SaaS metrics email called Clouded Judgment, that I've read recently, and it's been top of mind, and it kind of talks about how now that it used to be really hard to build a SaaS product, and folks could get to 100 million without worrying of anybody getting behind them because you had to build the physical server and buy your own data center and all of that. AWS and cloud infrastructure made it a bit easier to like build and scale a SaaS product, but you still needed, a decent sized team. Now, like anyone can build and launch something super quickly with a very small team and get to like 5 million plus in revenue, like pretty quickly. But there's already a lot of these companies that have done that or that are kind of capping out at 5, 10, and like so determining which ones are going to do that is very, very hard for most investors in this new world where it's just so easy to build and launch again with a very lean team.
Yeah. I don't want to push you to name names, but I do want to call out that I think one of the more successful companies at implementing this sort of incubation strategy has over the past, call it 5 years, has been HMH. And
Yeah,
they've both invested and bought pretty well. And
great.
it's interesting to me that you are now, it sounds like, seeing more corp dev teams across education thinking about that approach and
Yes.
trying to apply it with an AI lens. So again, like we're not going to go into names, but I think it's worth calling that out and thinking about how the other corp devs teams will fast follow or follow what HMH has been doing for the past few years and how that
Yeah.
sets up the competitive M&A processes.
Fully agree. I mean, the HMH Labs effort that Andrew Goldman's running, you don't see that type of investment across the large strategic, at least that deliberately. I mean, Imagine does have their own kind of AI focused venture fund, and I would say they're also has been a big part of their strategy as well from what I've seen on the outside. But yeah, I think you're right to call it out, and I think we'll probably see more of that across the other large strategics, and not that they haven't been doing it kind of in the background, but more deliberately with like a name on it, like HMH.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so again, setting aside the like specific organizations involved, are there any like theses that you're seeing of companies like trying to commit to a certain area that they think has a lot of growth potential? And I think the easiest historical example to point to is the big publishers' investment in workforce
Yeah.
companies over the past 5 years. Pearson has spent somewhere in the range of $500 million of acquisitions,
Yeah.
and Credly and Fathom and PRDI, et cetera. Cengage has bought a couple of workforce companies. Like, so that was clearly a theme that investors were pushing even the biggest companies in the world to have something to offer in.
Yeah.
Are there any other themes that you think of today that are, earlier in that process and we might see uh, more investment in?
So I got a crying dude here. So I think one that I'm really excited about, and I think we're seeing some pretty good innovation in this space, is just serving tier 3 students writ large, and kind of in addition to that, MTSS and how districts are approaching and implementing that as a strategy. And I'm talking from the K-12 perspective, of course, but I think there's tens of billions of dollars spent on special education and tier 3 services across all the different components in the market, and it's and the product universe, especially from a digital perspective, is actually really starting to evolve. And so I think as the SPED population as a percentage of the total student population continues to increase, I think there's real opportunity to build products and services to better scale the type of individualized attention you need to build into a product that serves special education students and special needs students. And I think on the flip side as well, as a founder, it's a really interesting space to build into, because what we've seen with, a lot of the most successful products in K-12 is a lot of them started out as focused on tier 3, and moving from tier 3 into tier 1 is way easier than building out a product that's meant for tier 1 students and then eventually serving tier 3 students. And so, you've seen a lot of the intervention specific products, think like iReady or Achieve 3000, Lexia. A lot of those products had to kind of, you know, prove that they worked for tier 3 and tier 2 students. Then everyone realized, like, hey, wait a minute, like this is actually great for tier 1 students as well. So I think, and I'm not just talking about instruction as well. I think like virtual therapy services, like there's just going to be a massive supply glut for school sites, sped teachers. So the products that can help scale out the individualized attention that I think tier 3 students and sped students need is a real opportunity, because despite what may happen with some of the stuff with the DOE and how that funding goes, like there's a lot of real money in the space, and I think just a ton of opportunity to I think help serve these students from a digital perspective. So that's one that I think we've been like looking at continually evaluating, at least from now perspective, and that I think I'm personally generally very excited about.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about like what would go into the product development cycle of building something, at least at the initial point for what you're calling tier three student, and then thinking about how it could scale into the general population and
Yeah,
what that process could look like and how that would affect your company building, right? And it's sort of like, obviously starting at the most resource intensive um, part of the spectrum and saying what is potentially generalizable and like how would that affect the growth path of the company.
yeah.
Um,
I think like one very under the radar company, maybe not since very recently, but TextHelp. I'm not sure if you know them, but they've been like quietly building, I think probably one of the largest and like most successful, EdTech SaaS products and platforms um, globally. And it's all focused on kind of it's assistive technology. And they've, via their backers from Rothschild have just been rolling up um, every quote competitor or just assistive provider in like localized different countries. And so they've been combined with N2Y now, which was I think a pretty
yeah,
massive deal. But it's a
yeah,
very under the radar story that not a lot of folks talk about. But I think like you watch out for them going into maybe like tier two and tier one instruction because they've just been quietly building out and just kind of taking over part of the space that we're talking about, and it's a really interesting M&A story if you kind of look under the hood and see everything they've done over the past 4 or 5 years.
yeah. My other favorite sort of under the radar ed tech company that's more higher ed is UWorld. I don't know if you've stumbled across them, but
No.
yeah, exactly. They're like a multi-$100 million, a year revenue company that has started quietly buying things. They're at more sort of direct threat from the like ChatGPTs of the world.
Yeah.
They are a little cheggish in what they focus on and that it's test prep, but usually for more professional exams, right? So like the AMCAT and like my wife used them in med school
Oh, cool.
for med school test prep questions, but totally bootstrapped by a doctor and like have been expanding to other sort of professional verticals. So,
The
but
test
there
prep
are
space is
these,
super hot right now. I think just overall, um, lots of these companies that are building in and able to grab hundreds of thousands of users and maybe a couple $1 million in revenue. It's a really interesting space to watch right now and something that we're also watching pretty closely as well.
yeah, I mean, it harkens back to our moat question of like
Yeah.
what does a moat look like in test prep? And I certainly don't know. You guys might have a more informed thesis. Um, so maybe one last question, and then I'll let you get back to Lyman and
Yeah.
Lyman time.
Yeah.
Um, so and it's related to text help and N2I of roll ups, right? And
Yeah.
I think like you know as I watch sort of private equity firms floating around the space, like I think a lot would be interested in roll up theses, but then trying to figure out which roll up theses could even work financially is its own sort of interesting question. So
Yeah. You can't roll
do you
up
have
the
any?
SISs. Yeah.
I have
Can't roll up the
there's I
US
mean,
SISs.
aren't both of the major SISs in the midst of trying to do that right now?
Yeah, but I mean, it's like, there's 100 and something in the US, right? And then I think like Power School and Infinite Campus, don't quote me on this, but probably have combined like 20% of the market, maybe max, maybe a little more now. Um, so yeah, I think that is one that just, financially would never make a ton of sense because like you can't, you just have to keep running them as separate systems because like, half of these are like on pretty
They're
old
so
school
baked
technology.
in.
Yeah. So there's, yeah, the product component just like and the architecture piece, just like combining even two of them, just from a technical perspective, just you just destroy too much value for it to make any real sense. Um,
Are there any areas where you think it would be cool to see a roll up or any roll ups that are just getting started that you're interested in following?
I think the professional development space, I think, is really interesting from a potential Rollup perspective. You have larger firms in the space like Better Lesson, Ed Elements, um, educational collaborators. There's a there's a few like from a relative scale perspective, medium sized players, and then there's just hundreds of local or regional players that provide professional development services to districts across, whether it's just focused on core instruction, or maybe it's around school transformation. But um, I think that that space will be interesting to watch. Like rolling up a bunch of services businesses is a tough prospect, and it's hard to get the type of synergy that you would hope for relative to rolling up software businesses. But I think that space, with the right strategy, could be
There's
really
so
interesting for
much
someone to
spend in
step
it
in.
though.
Yeah, yeah,
That's what's
yeah,
crazy is it's a
yeah,
huge market.
totally. And it's so fragmented. But that could, at least right now, it could be for a reason. Um, I think
Lyman the fifth is not a fan.
I know. You don't like PD, dude. Um, Another one that's like, close to home for me at least is, and I think you're starting to see this from a consolidation perspective. I wouldn't call it like a roll-up perspective, but like core and supplemental coming together. Um, you know, we're in a part of the core supplemental 10-year cycle, that's obviously very heavily indexed on core right now. And a lot of the core players have, I think, um, done very well over the past couple of years, and a lot of the supplemental players have suffered. But that's because of all of the pent up demand that kind of came about after they couldn't do adoptions during the pandemic. And there's also some really big adoptions coming up across California, Florida, and Texas, in math specifically. And so we're just in that part of like the cycle where a crap ton of core is being bought and used, and then a couple of years later, when people realize there's gaps, supplemental will come back and start winning the day again. But you're seeing, I think, either core providers consolidate themselves, um, or I think core providers really shore up their supplemental offerings, and I think that will start happening soon because again, the supplemental is going to swing back like it always does. There's an asterisk here because adoptions could start kind of waning in importance, as they kind of already have. Look what's happening in Texas, for example. Now you're going to have a state competing with core providers, which would be interesting. But needless to say, I think core and supplemental coming together. And then not just the thesis, like I think it will happen. I think it has to happen for a lot of different businesses. And I think if you're one or the other, you need if you're supplemental, you definitely need to be, I think, tied to a core course, or vice versa. You need to have supplemental products, if you do have a core offering. So I think we'll see that kind of like consolidation across those two categories. Whether it's core to core, core to supplemental, supplemental to supplemental. I think we're going to see a lot of that happening over the next 3 to 4 years.
Well, thank you. I'm very grateful
Sure.
to both of you,
Yeah,
and hopefully we can do this again sometime soon.
yeah, definitely.